Thank you, Senator. In closing, let me just say Ukrainians are dying. They're dying in a heroic fight, in a classic David versus Goliath fight. We can do something. We should do something. We've talked and talked, we've debated, and it's time to act. I ask unanimous consent that the Foreign Relations Committee be discharged from further consideration of Senate Bill 3652 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, reserving the right to object. First of all, let me agree with my Republican colleagues. We stand in awe today of the Ukrainian people, of President Zelensky, of the Ukrainian military. They have given the Russians more than they thought was coming. They have stood up a defense and a resistance that the world has watched with admiration. And the jury is frankly still out as to whether the Russians can make good on their plans, given how fierce the Ukrainians have fought. And I've been proud to stand with my colleagues on this floor as we have delivered additional aid to Ukraine, as we've made sure they've had the javelins and the stingers necessary to protect themselves. I've been proud to visit Ukraine with many of my colleagues here today, and we are going to continue to stand with the Ukrainian people. But I want to make 2 points today with respect to the effort that has been undertaken by my good friend, the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee. First, let me make a specific point on the merits of the bill that is being proposed here today. Passing this bill with no committee process, no amendments, no debate would be a terrible idea. What this bill does, essentially, is to shatter American unity with Europe, with Japan, with South Korea, with all the allies that have stood with us over the course of this past week. President Biden spent the last 2 months methodically building a never-before-seen coalition of nations to impose the most significant set of sanctions ever seen. And this bill would undo that. Why? Because this bill would mandate that the United States impose certain new sanctions over Europe's objection. It calls for the United States to abandon our policy of focusing on multilateral sanctions and start over with unilateral sanctions. Why is that a terrible idea? Well, first, because unilateral sanctions just aren't as effective as multilateral sanctions are. When you're talking about energy policy, you want the Europeans with you because that's where the Russian energy ends up. Without Europe going at it alone, it makes the United States look weak, and the sanctions just aren't as effective. But second, this bill is a bad idea because breaking with Europe and our NATO partners right now, that's exactly what Vladimir Putin wants. Yes, he wants to control Ukraine, but what he wants more is to smash the transatlantic alliance to pieces. He sees the invasion of Ukraine as a wedge that will cause America to squabble and break with our allies. Putin is setting a trap for us, and this bill would have us walk right into that trap. Third, let's be clear, with a couple of small exceptions, President Biden has already done everything that this bill calls for and more. This bill calls for sanctions on those responsible for the buildup of forces around Ukraine. The administration's imposed sanctions on Vladimir Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, 13 other members of Russia's Security Council. This bill calls for sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is done. Thanks to the committed diplomatic efforts of the Biden administration, the German government has put an end to Nord Stream 2, and we've applied the sanctions. This bill calls for sanctions on oligarchs. But Biden did that with our allies, and he went further. He launched a task force that's going to identify, freeze, and take from Russian oligarchs their assets. This bill calls for sanctions on financial institutions. The administration has already targeted all 10 of Russia's largest financial institutions, which hold more than 3/4 of the Russian financial sector's total assets. This bill calls for a prohibition on investment in occupied Ukrainian territory. President Biden did that on the first day of the war. This bill calls for sanctioning transactions involving Russian sovereign debt. President Biden did that on the second day of the war. This bill calls for sanctions on Belarus. President Biden's levied sanctions on 24 Belarusian individuals, 2 state-owned banks, and 13 of the country's industries. President Biden has put together a sanctions package that is sweeping, that is unprecedented, that is breaking the back of the Russian economy. So why are we down here on the floor engaged in this back and forth? And that brings me to my second point, a broader one. It used to be that the all-consuming politics of this town sometimes would take a break when the crisis was big enough. Sometimes they would stop at the water's edge. This was the case in 2001, when this country was attacked. Republicans were in charge of the White House and both houses of Congress, and Democrats certainly had the choice to blame the attack on President Bush to try to score political points. Democrats could have come down to the floor to offer partisan bills. Democrats in the Senate could have used their minority prerogatives to block Bush's national security nominees, but that's not what happened in 2001. Democrats and Republicans came together because at that moment, patriotism, the love of your country, the defense of your country was more important than politics or party. Now today, the shoe's on the other foot. Democrats control the White House, the House, and the Senate. And while our nation wasn't attacked last week, I'd argue that this moment is the most perilous that the United States and the world has faced, certainly since 2001, but given the nuclear stakes involved in a conflict with Russia, perhaps the most perilous since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I get it, the professional outrage machine that dominates American politics today has deluded a lot of folks into Congress into believing that unity is weakness, that putting your country over party is an anachronism. But I don't believe that. I believe that sometimes the stakes are so high that you got to put aside your politics, at least temporarily. Put aside your disagreements and get behind your government. Now, let's be honest, as this crisis has grown in seriousness over and over again, Republicans have had the chance to do what Democrats did in 2001, elevate loyalty to country. But all through 2021, even as senators were made aware of Russia's plans to invade Ukraine, Senators Cruz and Hawley and a few others continued to put politics first by blocking every single national security nominee who came before this body, including those nominees who would have been working to try to help Ukraine and stop the Russian invasion. Last month, Republicans and Democrats were working on a bipartisan bill to support Ukraine in its time of need. Those negotiations were difficult, but instead of staying at the table, Republicans walked away and with virtually no notice to Democrats introduced this bill with only Republicans supporting it. And now, instead of rallying behind a president who has shocked the world by uniting friends and foes behind an unprecedented set of crippling sanctions against Russia, Republicans are down here on the floor, not more than a week since the Russian invasion began, to highlight their grievances with the president's policies. Russia invaded less than a week ago. We returned to Washington last night. And instead of deciding to sit down with Republicans today and work on agreeing on a package of support for Ukraine, like the one that President Biden has requested, Republicans have instead chosen to spend today, our first day back in the Senate since the invasion, playing politics, trying to force a vote on a bill that they wrote that not a single Democrat supports, that everybody knows is not going to pass, has no chance of passing. Now, we could do the same thing. Democrats could just put a bill on the floor that we only negotiated with ourselves and force Republicans to vote on it. We could choose to use this week to highlight the differences between Republicans and Democrats, but we're not going to do that because our priority is to try to work together with our Republican colleagues to find unity at this moment, to not use the first day that we are back in session since the invasion began to highlight the differences between our two parties. And frankly, when I look at what Republicans have been calling on President Biden to do, I don't see a lot of daylight. I don't see a lot of reason for complaint. I don't see the imperative to come down here and highlight the differences. Nord Stream 2 is gone. It's not happening. SWIFT sanctions, previously opposed by Europe, are now happening. Russian banks are being crippled. Assets of Russian oligarchs are being seized. Vladimir Putin is being personally sanctioned. Embargoes are being put on key technologies sent into Russia. The set of sanctions that President Biden announced It goes further than what most all observers and pundits predicted. It's frankly stunning how successful President Biden's diplomacy has been. And it just strains all credibility for Republicans to suddenly claim that this diplomacy is irrelevant and all these countries were going to impose these sanctions even if President Biden did nothing. I wish my colleagues could see the seriousness of this moment and the need for us to focus our energies on coming together. Instead of playing into our enemy's hands and showing our differences at this moment. Our president has rallied the world to this fight. Vladimir Putin is reeling, but we're forced to spend time today debating a partisan bill introduced by only one party that has no chance of passage. Because today on this floor, scoring political points seems more important than finding a way to come together with the president, with both parties, around our support for Ukraine. And for those reasons, I object.
Madam President.
Objection is heard. Senator from Idaho.
Madam President, in rebuttal to my good friend's comments, first of all, let me say that a number of the things I do take exception with, for instance, his statement that if we pass this, we're going to somehow shatter the unanimity with which the world has come together to oppose this. Nothing could be further from the truth. Certainly, the sanctions that we have put on have been in conjunction with a lot of our allies and a lot of our partners. Simply putting on secondary sanctions, again, in conjunction with our allies and our partners, will not in any way shatter that at all. My good friend says, why are we here on the floor today? Senator, I would say the reason we're on here on the floor today is it's not enough. Now, you said I came down here to criticize the president. I did not criticize the president in anything I said. I applaud the action he's taken. I want him to take more. We have a convoy that's 40 miles long that's headed for Kyiv. Now, that convoy started out after all of these sanctions that the president put in place had taken effect. The banks, as you know, shut down, at least temporarily, in Russia. They've closed their stock market. They've done a number of things, but it's not enough. We need to toughen up. And as you know, I have talked with the administration to try to get them to embrace secondary sanctions, because it's the secondary sanctions that are truly going to shut the thing down lock, stock, and barrel. And Putin's going to have to answer to his people if we do get shut down. Look, this is not partisan. I'm not here to try to drive a wedge in the party. And as you know, your party had substantial input into the NYET Act that we have here. The chairman of the committee, I think, negotiated in good faith as we put this together. I've told him that personally. I've said that publicly. The fact is we came very close to the bill, and the NYET bill is very close to what we agreed to, but we couldn't come together on the last few things, and that is a permanent shutdown of Nord Stream 2, not just the sanctions that are in place on a temporary basis, but a permanent shutdown, and on secondary sanctions, which we believe will be the final nail in the coffin for the economy in Russia. So again, I answer the question you asked, why are we here? We're here because it's not enough. The convoys are continuing. There's tens of thousands of more soldiers, Russian soldiers, that are entering the Ukraine. They're having a tough time of it. And I agree with Senator Toomey. You know, you sit here and you see what's going on. The question you have to ask is, how long can the Ukrainians hold out? We want them to hold out. There are provisions in this act, as you know, that provides additional help for the Ukrainians themselves. But most importantly, what it will do is it will flat shut down the economy in Russia. In addition to that, you and I have discussed, I think, the fact that we can never use sanctions in a manner where we or our allies get hurt worse than the enemy does, or for that matter, to any great extent. That's why there are waivers in here. And sanctions always have waiver provisions in them so that it can take the edge off on anything that causes us or our allies any difficulties. So in that regard, I think that you're wrong on that. Back to the basic bill, I said I'm an all-of-the-above person. If the Democrats want to bring their bill down, which will probably look very much like this, but it won't have secondary sanctions in it. It won't have a permanent closing of Nord Stream 1 and 2. I will stand up here and say, we can do better, but I'm still going to vote for your bill. And I wish you would do that. I wish you would do that on mine. But I would respectfully request that you back away from this complaint that this is a partisan exercise. It is not a partisan exercise. There isn't a person in this body that doesn't want to do all we can possibly do to preserve the lives of the Ukrainians that are perishing every day, women, children, civilians. And we need to do all we can. And Putin is not going to be deterred until we do all that we can, and that comes to permanently shutting down completely shutting down the economy in Russia. This bill does that. And again, I apologize if you think that there's anything political about this. It's not. It's trying to do the right thing. As you and I have talked about, we have an obligation to do this as Americans, as the strongest country in the world. We can't stand by and watch this slaughter that is happening, and when that convoy gets there, is going to be even worse. This is something we can actually do to do more than what the president has done. And I'll say it, I said it before and I'll say it again. I commend the president for what he's done. But we also, as the first branch of government, have a responsibility. We believe this bill exercises that responsibility. Thank you, Madam President.